So thank you everyone for attending the National Farmers Union's webinar series, NF University. Our presenter today is Tatenda Mambo, and the topic is Seeds of Sustainability. While industrial agriculture has brought certain advantages and conveniences, it is important to acknowledge that many ways the food system fails to meet societal needs. Dr. Tatenda Mambo will highlight how regenerative and agroecological practices can address some of the concerns arising from the industrial agricultural systems and move agriculture away from depleting the very resources it is dependent on. Tatenda Mambo is a postdoc in the School of Agriculture, Planning and Landscape, and an instructor in the Sustainability Studies program at the University of Calgary. At the Simon Farm Project, his research team is using regenerative agriculture and agroecological principles to develop an integrated farm model that explores how a more local food system can use agriculture to address environmental problems and local food needs while modeling sustainability. So Tatenda, please go ahead with your presentation.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to all of you. I didn't realize that that the National Farmers Union has such a wide reach, but anyway, I'm excited to talk to you guys today, and I always like to start off with this cartoon here. Why it may sound weird or horrifying that cow patties become grass that feed cows all over again. I think coming from a sustainability background, this is how our planet has managed to function and not have huge inputs of external resources, and we are able to simply recycle the same nutrients on this planet over and over again. Based on that same notion, I always like to show this picture. This is an image of Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir, who was responsible for the creation of Yosemite National Park. And with that quote there, he notes that when we try to pick anything out by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And in many ways, everything we do has a reaction outside the sphere which we're immediately looking at. And from a systems thinking lens, we realize that how it is we treat our soils, how we grow our food, has rippling effects across society, our economic systems, and in the healthcare outcomes that we end up seeing. So this graphic here is shows a food system. And as you can see, there are many things that involve a food system, everything from biological systems to economic systems, to political systems, to the consumers. And any major changes in any one of these spheres has huge impacts across everything. I think a lot of this was highlighted during the COVID pandemic, where you ended up seeing lots of shortages of basic goods in stores based on disruptions of supply chains because we were all staying at home. And even in the livestock industry, or even in horticultural production, there were many instances of produce being left on the farm unpicked, while at the same time you had food shortages. And sometimes this calls into question the resilience of our system. But taking all this into account, I think it's important to realize that our agricultural system and our food system is largely dependent on natural resources. And as divorced as we may be from some of those systems, when we are living in cities where we maybe don't see where stuff comes from, it's all tied to the natural environment. And as such, we need to be aware of and realize that agriculture is dependent on these natural resources. And as a result, the environmental conditions determine what we can do with our agricultural landscapes. This satellite image is taken over Saskatchewan. And you can, if you've ever been in a plane and you look down as you fly over Canada or the US, you'll see we've very conveniently broken up our land into these little parcels of land, and we are dependent on soil, water, climate to enable us to produce this food. And as such, how we eat and our food system is the largest way we actually interact with the natural world. And as a result, we have huge impacts on the relationship our society has with different biogeochemical systems to try and meet these needs that we have. With that being said, I think it's important to talk about some planetary boundaries. A lot of you are probably familiar with this. These are different planetary boundaries that the planet has, and there's an effort to try and stay within the safe zone and not go beyond the ability for certain resources to regenerate themselves. And for all of the, I'll call your attention to the areas where we have, we've gone beyond the zone into high risk areas. And you'll note they are in biogeochemical flows of nitrogen, of phosphorus, and with genetic biodiversity. And you'll note that all of these are strongly linked to agriculture. Due to nutrient runoff from farms, due to the Haber-Bosch process, we are actually releasing a lot of these chemicals into the natural environment in quantities larger than they are used to receiving, which lead to problems further downstream, which we'll talk about further on. Genetic diversity is another big thing, especially related to agriculture, where we see, first of all, limited varieties of crops that we grow, but additionally, a lack of biodiversity in general as natural lands are converted to agricultural cropland, which then result in less of that diversity of things. And land system changes is another one there, which is increasing risk. And as you all know, climate change is another big concern, which we are desperately trying to work on. And as much as climate change is going to cause major disruptions to agriculture, the way our agricultural systems play out actually have a huge impact on how severe climate change can be. But we'll address some of that stuff going forward. So taking all of this into account and looking at how we have certain boundaries, we're trying to either limit the severity of that disruption. The question that comes up for me is, what is our role and what's our place on this planet, and how should we be interacting with the natural world? And I'd like to introduce these two men. You might know Descartes. He's very famous for the phrase, "I think, therefore I am," and Spinoza. They stood on opposite sides of some of the ideas that govern or that determine how we should interact with our natural world. And René Descartes was a big advocate for rational thought and the process of taking humans out of dogma and using empirical evidence and the ability to reason to reorganize the elements of nature in ways that suit the needs of humanity, essentially creating the world in our image for our purposes. On the opposite end of that was Spinoza, who really advocated more for an approach where man's role was to become better acquainted with God/nature, not by advocating for God to change the way the world works to suit man, but instead to honor nature and God by understanding and mastering how nature works to then live within how it functions. And even in sustainability today, there's this constant tug between these two extremes. Are we going to, for example, use technology to solve all our problems and remake the world in a way that suits what we want? Or do we take the example from nature and then try and live within the laws and elements that nature has actually created? And with that being said, there tends to be this push and pull between these two, but it's more of a continuum. Because I think regardless of what action you're taking, there is an element of taking things and trying to make them suit our needs, while still honoring the fact that they are things given to us by nature. So we don't create biology, but we can, use genetic modification to start to change how that biology then interacts with things. So I'm trying to illustrate here that it's not a black or white, but it's more of this continuum. And I think depending on where your ethics or your morals lie on this, and I think more importantly, what it is we're trying to solve for, you will fall on this continuum. And lastly, I'll talk about this notion of weak versus strong sustainability. It's another concept that we talk a lot about in today's world. So I'm not going to talk about the background, but weak sustainability, if you haven't heard about it, is this concept where sustainable development is found where these three elements of nature, society, and economy intersect. And when we can achieve that, that's wonderful. But there's many instances where we operate outside of the intersection of these three important elements and we continue as usual. Whereas strong sustainability really takes the notion that natural capital is not negotiable and we can't replace natural capital. And as such, it is important that we keep natural capital in a functioning and intact state, not just for ourselves, but we owe it to future generations. And as such, our societies should then function within the limits of natural capital, and our economies should serve the needs of society. And the fundamental question here is, can human capital replace natural capital? I don't know that there's a clear answer to this question. There's debate out there as to whether we can replace things that nature has given us, destroy them and lose them, but still be able to function. So for an example would be, if we happen to lose honeybees, what do we do for pollination? There's been examples in parts of China where they lost honeybees and humans became the pollinators. There's ideas of maybe using robotics to maybe use technology and machines to do that. So I think as we talk about sustainability and how we move forward, I think this push-pull between these two ideas is important to remember and to keep in mind. So I'm going to talk a bit about the industrial food system. And in many ways, the industrial food system is what feeds most of us, especially in the West. Maybe this crowd of people might be a bit different given that you are mostly farmers. But a thing I'd like to note here is the many different actors involved in this process and the level of separation between those consuming the food versus those who are growing the food. And one thing that starts to happen with an industrial system with all these different actors is, with more separation between consumers and producers, food becomes more of a commodity, and we start to lose the use value of the food itself. When food moves between these different actors, at times the value of the food being something that is meant to nourish or feed people may go to the back burner of the question, and it may become something more concerned about what is the value of this economically, and how can I squeeze more value out of something, either by processing it, which may compromise the integrity of the food itself, but in essence, gain more economic value. And as such, this food system has certain characteristics that keep people, especially the producers and consumers, far away from each other, which is an analogy has been used that a food system looks like an hourglass, right? And you have lots of producers who all squeeze through different traders and processors, and you have lots of consumers on the other end. And there isn't always great communication between these two people, or sometimes the food system doesn't reflect the values of these people. You can see this consolidation as well on a global scale in terms of the seed market and chemical market. And you'll notice that some of these companies have merged within the last 5 to 7 years, further consolidating things. Just to highlight more of this consolidation in the food market is, we see a lot of brands in stores, but if you trace everything back, there's only a few handful of people who actually own and control those brands. And as a consumer, you have this, I would say, an illusion of choice. But in actual terms, a lot of the people pulling the puppet strings, which is what this looks like to me, is all these companies and these brands who have these long tentacles and can affect what ends up on store shelves. And we have this illusion of lots of choice. But with that, let's look at some of the characteristics of this industrial food model. So it tends to be very large scale. And a thing often touted about it is that it's efficient. And I think it's important to highlight something here, that it's efficient with regards to return on financial investment. But from an ecological perspective, I would argue it is not efficient at all, because if you convert all the energy used in food production using non-renewable resources that come from fossil fuels, it takes about 7 to 10 calories of energy to produce 1 calorie of food. And no matter which way you cut it, that is not efficient. It's important to note the economic system is something we as a society created, and we've conveniently chosen to leave out the ecological costs of some of our practices, which is why things like climate change are becoming a major concern, because the financial system itself does not reflect the cost of all those things. So it may still be profitable to do something that does not actually enhance our ecological systems. Monocultures are a major theme, which is part of that efficiency. And I'd like to highlight here the loss of pollinators. I think there's a lot of concern directed towards honeybees, which is important. But outside of honeybees, there are many other pollinators out there. And the honeybees have a huge, a vast group of people who are vested in their continuation. But things like carpenter bees and lacewings and wasps don't have the same kind of backing behind them. And a lot of these natural pollinators in our ecosystems that don't give us honey, and we don't get as much of use value from trying to care for them, are in major decline as we lose more and more natural areas. Again, it's energy and resource intensive, and farmers get a small return for every dollar spent. According to the USDA, it's about 16%. And unfortunately, these recent price increases we've been seeing, a lot of that is not actually going to the farm gate or going to the farmers themselves. So all this to say, on a global level, we are clearly producing enough food to feed everyone, right? We need about 2,000 to 2,500 calories to feed everyone. We're producing more than enough on a global level, which in part is thanks to that industrial system, right? At the same time, we've seen a lot of meatification of our diets, right? a lot more meat consumption. If you go back from the 1960s to where we are today, we have almost double the amount of meat we are consuming. And part of why and how that's possible is partly how it is we're using our agricultural crops, right? This is a graphic created by the National Geographic. This came out in 2014. And it's a graphic that shows how we are using our crops, right? As you can see from the legend here, there's about a 50-50 split between land area being used for food production versus land area being used for feed and fuel. And a lot of cultivation of crops, of land system change or conversion of lands out there is done to grow more food that feeds livestock, right? Which has made meat more affordable, and a lot of people like eating meat, which is a great benefit for many people. But it's important to note the reducing returns on that conversion of grain to meat or protein, right? And these conversion rates kind of speak for themselves as to how much it takes to convert 1 pound of body mass from the amount of grain you need. And as you can see here, cattle is the highest, where you need 6.8 pounds to produce 1 pound of weight on that animal, right? Which has certain concerns down the road with regards to that notion of efficiency, which has concerns with regards to whether we're producing enough food on the global level to actually feed everyone. Clearly, we are, but that distribution isn't always there for everyone. So let's talk about some of the other benefits that the food system gives us. So one of those things is low cost. If you live in a wealthy nation, you spend no more than 20% of your income on food. This graphic on the bottom here, this is from the USDA showing the amounts of money spent on food in the US from 1960 to 2019. And as you can see, decade after decade, it has dropped to just over 10%. For Canada, we're sitting at 10.7% as of 2021. It's gone up a little bit over the last few years because of the pandemic, but it's still, food is still an affordable thing for most Canadians. We talked about efficiency above all already, but convenience is a major thing. I think our food system has really made food something you don't really have to think about, as long as you have access to money. Things are packaged so conveniently. I'll tell a quick story. I had a friend whose garden I used to take care of for him, and I used to grow lettuce for him, and he would rather go to the store and buy bagged lettuce, because all I had to do was open the bag and pour dressing on it, rather than going to the garden and picking the lettuce and washing it and making a vinaigrette. So, I mean, convenience has really made food something we don't really think about as much. And you don't need cooking skills anymore. But at the top of the slide, there's a question mark, benefits to the food system. I'm not sure that all these things are as good as it may seem on the surface. But again, there's disparate experience of these factors globally and even regionally as well. This graphic here shows food expenditures across the globe. And as you can see, if you're in a wealthy country, so Canada and the US here, we're talking about 10%. Western Europe, you're looking more at about max is about 20%. As you start to move further and further away from these regions, food costs start really going up in terms of what people spend. I did my PhD in Southern Africa, in Malawi, and a lot of people I interviewed there reported spending upwards of 70% of their income on food. So this is something that has really benefited more wealthy nations. But we'll start talking about some of the negative things that come part and parcel with our food system. So while we've clearly shown we can produce enough food to feed everyone, we are producing so much food, we're giving some of it to livestock to get diminishing returns from it, to be able to eat meat proteins. But we still have situations where there is undernourishment, right? You may have heard this idea of the triple burden of malnutrition. So we still have over 1 billion people who go hungry globally. We have this interesting situation where we have obesity, and you have obese people who are undernourished at the same time. And that's part of a reflection of how our food system, through processing and through serving processed foods and lack of access to fresh produce, lack of access to nutrient-dense foods, you have this peculiar situation of obesity and undernourishment, which I am from Southern Africa. I'm from Zimbabwe, and my grandparents would be shocked to try and juxtapose these ideas of how can you be, overweight and undernourished at the same time. But as well with that, we have increasing rates of diabetes, and I mean, rampant issues with regards to metabolic syndrome, which largely is a factor of the diets we eat and lifestyle. And then lastly, micronutrient deficiencies globally. We have over 2 billion people who face micronutrient deficiencies. I just thought it'd be good to give a bit of context of what's happening in Canada. Over the last 10 to 15 years, increases have taken place with regards to household food insecurity. Proof, which produced this map, is a great source of data on food insecurity in Canada. Sad to see that Alberta today has the highest rate of food insecurity. Just to get a better handle on that, we can look at prevalence of food insecurity by province, separated by severely food insecure, moderately, and marginally. And you can see overall, all of these numbers have been growing up over the last few years. And even though Canada is a wealthy nation, it's clear that there are still many people who fall through the cracks. And even though the reason we produce and eat food is to nourish people, there are clearly problems within the food system itself. We'll talk a bit about some environmental and social problems that come up with regards to our food system. So as we talked back at the beginning about how we need natural resources in order to enable agriculture to take place. And a lot of this starts with the soil. Agricultural practices have notoriously been problematic, especially industrialized agriculture with regards to how it treats the soil. I may be preaching to the choir here. You probably all know this stuff, so I won't spend too much time on it. But soil erosion rates in Canada have come down quite a bit from the 1970s, but it's still a concern. This image here was featured in Lethbridge News, and because of the reduced snowpack, there's been an increase in wind erosion. And really, with wind erosion, it's not just the soil particles you're losing with that. You're losing organic matter. You're also losing any nutrient that have been put down on that soil, and you're potentially also spreading plant diseases with it. But it's really a wasted resource, and globally we are losing soils at alarming rates, to where based on the rate of soil loss, it's not a renewable resource. But the legacy of how we've treated soils has led to compaction, which leads to problems with water infiltration rates. And also it results in the soil being a source of carbon rather than a sink for carbon, which could actually help us address climate change. Scientific American 2017 came out with a statement that there were only 60 years left of farming based on the current condition of global soils and the rate of soil loss. Sorry, I'm just going to close this blind. And I find that really alarming. Yeah, 60 years. Another way I thought of that was there's only 60 harvests left unless something major is done. Another big concern is water. So we briefly talked about eutrophication with regards to the phosphorus and nitrogen cycle. But again, a lot of this eutrophication is a result partially of the fertilizers we put on our soils washing off and polluting waterways. Phosphorus in particular is really problematic in this context. This here is an algal bloom of a lake in Manitoba. And especially in Canada, water is another big concern with regards to agriculture, because of the fact that only about 16% of Canadian farmland is irrigated. So we're heavily dependent on rainfall. And with climate change, all of the models are showing that you're going to have more intense rain and longer dry spells. Well, at least this is true for Alberta. I'm not sure how it is in other parts of Canada, especially in the east. But as we've seen in Alberta and in British Columbia, the presence of atmospheric rivers and these much longer, drier spells really makes agriculture more precarious if you're dependent on rainfall. In our project, we've seen instances of just long dry periods, a few times of intense rainfall, and then long dry periods again, which our soils are not in a place where they can absorb all that moisture and keep it for the times when we need that moisture during those dry spells. But I also noted depleted aquifers, because being a global food system in Canada, a lot of the produce we eat, especially during the winter months, comes from other places. And in different parts of North America, such as California, you probably know that there's depleting aquifers where there's a race to get to the bottom of those aquifers using more and more intense infrastructure. Another huge concern is food waste. So globally, about a third of everything that's produced gets wasted. This was a shocking report. Second Harvest that brought out in 2019, about 58% of all food produced in Canada is wasted, representing about $38 billion worth. And this is a major concern because of the emissions impact that it has, especially if it ends up in landfill, creating methane, which is a many times worse greenhouse gas. But it also reflects wasted resources. So we're undercutting and destroying natural resources to produce food that we end up throwing out anyway, which is really concerning. There are efforts by a number of agencies to actually try and recover what we consider wasted food. So there are a number of startups and initiatives that are, trying to stop this stuff from going into dumpsters, trying to stop this stuff from going to landfill in the first place. But I definitely think, yeah, you know what, I will skip that. If we want to talk more about that, we can deal with that in the questions session. And then lastly, food deserts. So this is more of a social thing and how we construct our cities and how people have access to food. A lot of people in low-income areas have difficulty accessing fresh produce or nutrient-dense food. And as well, we're seeing an increased reliance on food charities as a result of the increase in food insecurity, which again is a reflection of our poor social safety net. To throw another thing on top of this, climate change really is gonna further disrupt things. So we're seeing reducing yields due to damaged resource bases such as soils, but in light of growing demand, as our population continues to increase, we are asking more of our natural resources in light of them being in a damaged state, and we can't rely on the climate as much as we used to. Seeing more weather extremes, and there's going to be an uneven impact of these effects between the temperate zones and the tropic zones. This is an image of these, a couple images here I highlight from Malawi, where I did some of my work, where this is the same district, and within a 2-year gap, you can see how you had flooding in 2017, but in 2016 you had a drought. And this is becoming very common in Southern Africa. When I grew up there were never talks of hurricanes or typhoons. But since living in Canada, there's been 2 since I've been away, and it's really quite surprising. So with all this in mind, from a farming perspective, this perspective again of an egocentric or an ecocentric worldview exists in agriculture as well. And von Liebig, who's known as the father of agricultural chemistry, his work really ushered in this phase of reductionist science, taking and understanding the elements you need to know in order to grow plants, and then using those to ignore everything else and focus on what best produces plants. And that's contrasted by Sir Albert Howard's perspective, whose view was that in order to address the concerns we have with human health or problems with the soil, you need to treat it as one great subject. We'll talk more about him in a sec, but as you see here, we have all these alternatives we have developed that are alternatives to the industrial system. There's a laundry list of them. There's many similarities between these. And sometimes it may be a different political leaning or the timing where it came from, or how much people are counter to the culture. But these are all different iterations of ideas about maybe we need to change how it is we are farming. But an important question that is raised by Christopher Rhodes in his paper on the imperative for regenerative agriculture is sustainable agriculture possible? We don't have an example from nature that shows that a natural ecosystem can be disturbed annually to grow annual crops and yet continually, reliably continue to produce agricultural products in perpetuity, raising this question, especially when we get to, large settlements. And, if anyone has read Robert Montgomery's book on soils, that's every civilization that's fallen really saw a a major impact to their soils. But one thing I'd like to highlight here as well is this notion of there being a difference between sustainable and regenerative agriculture. To sustain something is merely to keep it going. Regenerative implies this idea of trying to regenerate or to replenish or to restore something that has been lost. And I feel with so much of our talk about sustainability, we want to be able to keep doing what we're doing, even if it's in a damaged state, but not necessarily go back to actually restore it.
Tatenda, just a quick time check. You've got about 10 more minutes.
Okay, thank you. That being said, I think I'll skip this slide. A lot of you have probably seen this before. This is the soil food web. Dr. Elaine Ingham has repopularized this idea of the soil food web. And I think a lot of what these alternatives to agriculture are trying to do is use biology as a driving force to cycle nutrients and make it possible to actually have a food system that continually cycles quote unquote waste, or that cycles nutrients through different trophic levels to enable us growing plants. So with regenerative agriculture, there isn't an accepted definition that everyone agrees on. But looking at this slide, you'll notice that there are a few things everyone tends to talk about. Like I mentioned before, it's about restoration, but it goes beyond just plants in the ground. It also talks about increasing biodiversity, regenerating topsoil, biosequestration, ecosystem services, realizing that the farm functions beyond simply being a place to grow plants, but it's connected to everything else around it. And we want to increase the vitality of everything functioning within that system. That being said, there's a list of practices that tends to come with that approach. And I think this slide really does a good job of showing what the paradigm shift is between these approaches. I'll just highlight this bottom one. It's going from a reductionist perspective to a holistic one. But I think part of the issue with not being agreed upon definition is because regenerative practices are going to be very different depending on your location and the operation that you're running. And maybe not all of those practices will apply and make sense. So I'm going to talk briefly about Simon Farm and some of the work that we're doing. As you can see from this graphic, we are involved in growing a number of different things, but the basic goals we have is to use the soil food web and biological activity as the driving force behind food production, application of agroecological and regenerative practices, and engaging communities, especially for the outcomes of education, research, and inspiration and nutritional outcomes as well. So we're located in Blackie, Alberta, just east of High River. This is the property that was made available to us by Dr. John Simon, who unfortunately passed away about 2 months ago. He was in his 90s. Our goal is to create what's called what we are calling an integrated farm model. This is the ideal we're working towards. In many ways, we are not there yet. So we don't have hogs on the farm yet. We've had a few challenges. But as you can see from this graphic, we're trying to, all the green stuff shows target crops and produce that either goes to market or goes to feed other entities on the farm. And then all the brown stuff is quote unquote waste products that we're trying to recapture the value from to then further put back and use on the farm itself. So these are a few of the activities we have on the farm. a number of many different beds. I'll show you some pictures of different beds that we are running. A few things I'll highlight is we have an orchard we're starting here. And we have beginnings of what to hopefully be a hop yard. And then we have some mushroom production down here. So we have that image came, this image came from that spot I just last showed you. These are outdoor mushroom beds that we have. We have indoor mushroom cultivation as well. This is lion's mane for anyone who recognizes that. We have some hydroponics growing in our greenhouse, and some Kingstrophoria production as well outside. With everything we do, we plant in polycultures. This idea of trying to improve and increase biodiversity. We initially started using square foot gardening, which we're going to be moving away from because it can get very complicated when it comes time for planting. But we're still going to continue this idea of planting in polycultures and pairing plants that support each other. We got access to this land in 2019, and ever since then, we've been running this this trial between what we call the north bed and the control bed. And essentially the differences are, this was one giant bed when we started off. We used no-till methods on the north bed. It's covered with a layer of mulch all times of the year, and is never disturbed. We plant the exact same things. We mirror everything we plant on the control side, where that is tilled, and we apply some chemical fertilizer to it. And this is what the north bed looks like during cultivation. Again, always in polycultures and intersecting different plants. This is a control bed. I showed this for transparency because we have major weed problems in this bed, and we don't have the manpower to keep it as weeded as we would like. But as you can probably see, these are some of the plants here. We try and keep away from all of the, we try and give them some sunlight so that they're not completely smothered with all those weeds. This is some of the produce and some of the numbers we've been getting from these beds. This is data from a 2-year average between 2020 and 2021 of carrots, beans, and peas. The north bed is producing more, but I think those results are a bit skewed because of the inability for us to keep on top of the weeds and manage it the way a conventional operation would. We also have some horticultural beds that we're trialing. So we created a flip sod bed and a root stout bed. If you guys are familiar with permaculture, you might recognize those terms. The flip sod bed essentially flips the sod over on top of another layer of grass, creating a natural raised bed, which means you have 2 layers of decaying grass on either side, which hopefully increases organic matter. The root stout bed is basically a sheet mulching approach. We also have a hugelkultur and wood chip mulch beds, which we've been trialing since 2020. And these are some of those beds with produce growing in them and what they look like. This here is some data from the productivity of those different bed styles. The flip sod beds have been really quite productive relative to their size. And I think that presence of 2 layers of decaying organic matter probably made a big difference. The hugelkultur is a bit slow, but we've been seeing increasing returns over time, which is what you would expect. The wood chip mulch bed has been kind of disappointing, but we're slowly seeing improvement for these beds over time, which is the hope. The other thing we're doing is seed trials. So the question that led us to this approach was, how do locally saved seed varieties perform against nationally distributed seeds in different regions? The premise being that seeds that are locally saved have adapted to the traits of the region they were saved from. And we work with seeds from a different seed suppliers. There are a number of constraints with the study because it's not always easy to know exactly where the seed was saved, and finding enough varieties of seeds from different seed providers is also a challenge. But this is some of the work that we did. So the Provida bush bean trials, we don't have any reading for this because we lost most of the plants due to the heat dome we got in 2021. And in 2022, every single seedling was gobbled up. We have problems with deer and ground squirrels. And it's been a bit disappointing with those. We also have one with Swiss chard. And we have no issues with those. The extreme weather events that we've seen in terms of heat and drought have really helped these locally saved seeds outperform the nationally distributed seeds, though the BRICS readings don't support that, which is a bit surprising. I'll just have a couple more slides. We have a Siberian kale trial as well, which the largest problem is black flea beetle, as you can see in this image here. We also have a carrot trial, which pests have also been a major concern. You can see deer have been coming and eating some of the greens, but we still have some useful data to go off of from here. See, there's some of the other additional projects we're working on, which include pairing mushroom production with growing plants, growing more perennial crops. We started some biochar trials last year, which we're hoping to continue, and then hopefully construction of an agrivoltaic solar shelter. I'm going to leave it there and open it up for questions.
Great, thanks so much, Tatenda.